What if everything you think you know about medieval justice is only a fraction of a much darker reality, one that specifically targeted peasant women in ways far more brutal than the official chronicles ever dared to record? Imagine living in a world where simply speaking too loudly, resisting an order, or defending your own land could turn you into an enemy of the kingdom overnight. In medieval societies, women from the lowest classes were not only expected to obey the rigid hierarchy around them, they were expected to disappear into it. And when they refused, the retaliation they faced was engineered to break not just their bodies, but the memory of their defiance. The deeper you look into that period, the more you uncover a system built on fear, public shame, and institutional cruelty. It was not just about punishment, it was about erasing any possibility of rebellion. Authorities understood that a rebellious woman, even a single one, could inspire others to question the order imposed on them. So the state, the church, and local lords created a machinery of control that functioned both in daylight and in secrecy, weaponizing humiliation, forced labor, confiscation of property, and forms of psychological violence that rarely appear in official manuscripts. These records were carefully edited, leaving out the methods that would expose how far rulers went to maintain power. And yet, despite the silence of the archives, the traces remain. Reports of women accused of unrest, moral disorder, or disturbing the peace were often coded descriptions of acts as simple as refusing a tax, confronting a guard, or demanding fairness at a market. Once labeled rebellious, these women were subjected to protocols designed to isolate them from the community and transform their punishment into a warning. Their stories survive through fragments, through whispered oral traditions, through the reactions of those who witnessed the cruelty but were too afraid to speak openly. If you have ever wondered how entire populations were kept under control without constant armies patrolling the streets, the answer lies here, in these hidden structures of oppression. Understanding what these women endured is essential to understanding how medieval kingdoms maintained the illusion of stability. Their suffering was a political tool, a weapon disguised as justice, and the more we unveil, the more the official narrative begins to unravel. Have you ever felt that some parts of history were intentionally softened, as if someone hoped you would never look too closely at them? What you are about to learn may challenge everything you believed about medieval society and the place of women within it. Before we go deeper, tell me what you think so far. Have you ever imagined that rebellion from a simple peasant woman could trigger such extreme reactions from a kingdom? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, or any experience you have reflecting on how history hides its darkest sides. And if this kind of content helps you understand the past in a clearer way, make sure you like this video and check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because what comes next is even more revealing as we continue uncovering what centuries tried to bury. The hidden mechanisms that governed medieval life did not rely solely on weapons or royal decrees. They relied on something far more subtle and far more permanent, the quiet weaving of social punishment into the fabric of daily existence. For peasant women, this meant that every gesture, every word, every interaction was observed not only by neighbors, but by a system that taught communities to police each other. A rebellious woman did not need to be physically restrained for her world to collapse around her. All that was required was for the village to see her as someone who threatened the order on which their survival depended. And that perception was carefully shaped by authorities who understood the power of fear better than they understood the law. The machinery began with reputation. A single accusation, even one whispered without proof, could turn a woman into an outcast long before any official punishment was declared. Medieval records reveal vague but deliberate terms like disruptive, unruly, defiant, all of which carried heavy consequences despite lacking concrete definition. These labels were not legal categories, they were social weapons. Once branded, a woman could be excluded from common resources, denied entry into markets, or pushed out of communal gatherings where essential decisions were made. This form of isolation was not accidental. It was engineered to weaken her until she either submitted or became too broken to resist anything. But the system did not stop at social exclusion. There were methods designed to ensure that her rebellion never inspired others. Village elders were often pressured to participate, transforming punishment into a collective ritual that reinforced loyalty to the authorities. They might be instructed to deny her aid during harvest, refuse her access to wells, or ensure she had no witnesses to support her side of a conflict. Through these actions, the community became an extension of the ruling power, enforcing control even when officials were miles away. And for women already burdened by endless labor, scarce food, and harsh winters, this silent assault could be more devastating than any physical blow. The violence was disguised, as custom, as tradition, as the natural way things had always been. That illusion made it nearly impossible for women to challenge it openly. The rules shifted from region to region, but the intention was consistent. A rebellious woman had to be reshaped or removed. The system relied on the idea that the threat of humiliation was enough to maintain obedience. Authority figures did not need grand trials or elaborate punishments when they could erode a woman's stability from within her own community. And yet the most disturbing part is how often these practices were recorded as simple disputes or moral corrections, stripped of their true meaning. As you begin to see how this invisible structure operated, the question becomes unavoidable. How many women were broken not by official punishment, but by a system that turned their entire world into a tool of discipline? The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that what was written down as order and harmony was built on the quiet suffering of those who dared to resist, and their stories echo through the fragments that survived, waiting to be pieced back together. As influence and authority merged during the medieval period, the church became one of the most powerful engines sustaining the control imposed on peasant women. Its reach extended into every field, every home, every whisper exchanged between neighbors. What made its influence so terrifying was not simply its spiritual authority, but how effectively it blurred the line between divine will and political strategy. By the time the punishments against rebellious women became common practice, the church had perfected a language that framed obedience as salvation and dissent as sin. This ideological structure created a world where punishing a woman seemed not only socially acceptable, but morally required. Church officials often acted as interpreters of behavior, deciding which actions reflected virtue and which revealed moral decay. A woman who challenged a tax, protected her property, or refused unfair orders could suddenly find herself portrayed as someone leading her community into spiritual danger. Her defiance became a threat not just to order, but to the souls of those around her. The brilliance of this tactic was its subtlety. Instead of openly labeling these women as enemies of the kingdom, the church recast their rebellion as a stain on Christian morality, a moral sickness that required correction for the sake of the entire village. This fusion of spiritual doctrine and political necessity transformed ordinary conflicts into cosmic battles between good and evil. Women accused of stubbornness or insubordination were increasingly described in spiritual terms, their defiance reframed as temptation, disobedience, or even flirtation with darkness. Once placed in this moral framework, their punishment became an act of purification. Villagers participated not because they were cruel by nature, but because they believed they were defending their community from contamination. In this environment, violence was repackaged as duty. Church courts, although varying widely in their procedures, often avoided recording the full extent of their involvement in disciplinary actions. Instead, they left behind vague rulings that concealed the mechanisms of abuse. Terms like moral correction or spiritual redirection hid the reality that these women were isolated, humiliated, or forced into confessions extracted under pressure. Even written penances could be manipulated, demanding endless acts of public repentance that would follow a woman for the rest of her life. Every step she took in the village square reminded others of her supposed failure, ensuring she remained an object lesson long after the initial conflict had faded. The most disturbing part is how seamlessly these practices integrated into everyday life. Villagers rarely questioned whether the punishments were excessive because the church presented them as reflections of divine order. Under that narrative, mercy became a risk, tolerance a dangerous indulgence. In this atmosphere, even women who had committed no rebellion at all could be drawn into the web of suspicion. A mere argument, a refusal, or an emotional outburst could place them under spiritual scrutiny. It is within this environment that the machinery of persecution flourished, shaping the fate of countless women whose only crime was resisting the role imposed upon them. As the church's influence tightened its grip, the space for dissent narrowed until even the simplest acts of self-assertion were painted as profound moral violations, and the path forward for these women became increasingly suffocating, swallowed by a system determined to rewrite their existence as a cautionary tale. Once the church had provided the moral justification, and the community had been conditioned to participate, medieval kingdoms employed methods of punishment that were deliberately theatrical, crafted to carve fear into memory. These punishments were not hidden in dark chambers. They were performed in the open, transforming humiliation into a spectacle that reminded everyone of the price of defiance. For peasant women labeled rebellious, the body itself became the surface upon which the state wrote its warnings. The goal was never justice. It was visibility, the kind that lingered in the minds of those who watched, ensuring compliance long after the event ended. Public humiliation was often the first step, designed to strip women of dignity in the eyes of their neighbors. Being bound to a post, paraded through the village, or forced to wear degrading symbols placed her rebellion on display. These acts were meticulously crafted to ensure the community saw her as an object of ridicule rather than sympathy. The intent was to fracture any bonds that might protect her. If a woman lost the support of her peers, she lost the only shield she had against authority. And once isolated, harsher punishments could be inflicted with little resistance. Physical punishments followed patterns meant to injure without killing, because survival served a purpose. A living woman, marked by scars or disabilities, became a permanent reminder of the dangers of resisting the structures around her. Stocks, whipping posts, and devices of restraint were positioned in central areas, ensuring that the image of punishment blended seamlessly into daily life. The violence was normalized, appearing as natural as market days and church gatherings. This normalization allowed kingdoms to maintain control without deploying armies. Fear became self-sustaining. There were also ritualized punishments rooted in superstition, ceremonies that framed a woman's suffering as a cleansing process. She might be forced to confess publicly, repeat prescribed phrases, or endure symbolic acts meant to purify the community from her influence. These rituals blurred the line between punishment and performance. They reassured villagers that order had been restored while reinforcing the idea that rebellion carried an almost supernatural danger. The more spectacle involved, the more unforgettable the warning became. Yet some of the most chilling methods remain absent from official accounts. Oral histories speak of women subjected to extended periods of enforced silence, confined in ways that left no visible wounds but destroyed their ability to communicate their stories. Others describe punishments that targeted social identity, such as forbidding women from entering communal areas, preventing them from speaking during gatherings, or forcing them to perform degrading labor meant to signal their supposed inferiority. These practices rarely appear in manuscripts because their effectiveness depended on secrecy, on the quiet harm that left no trace except in memory. As these layers of violence accumulated, they shaped a world where punishment was not merely a response to rebellion, but a tool for sculpting obedience across generations. And yet, the echoes of these rituals still linger, revealing how deeply medieval kingdoms depended on the suffering of women to maintain their fragile power structures. Before we continue, I would like to hear your thoughts. Which of these forgotten punishments surprised you the most, or made you reflect on how history selectively preserves certain truths? Share your impressions in the comments so we can deepen this exploration together as we move forward. Beneath the surface of these punishments, another layer of cruelty operated quietly yet decisively. The profit extracted from the suffering of peasant women. Medieval kingdoms did not simply punish rebellion, they monetized it. Every accusation, every ritual of humiliation, every recorded act of disobedience became an opportunity for authorities to reinforce their financial power. The machinery of discipline was not only ideological and social, it was economic. And women from the lower classes, lacking wealth and protection, became prime targets for a system that fed on their vulnerability. Fines were the most obvious form of exploitation. Although they were recorded as simple penalties, they often exceeded what a peasant household could realistically produce. A single accusation of disturbing the peace or defying a local order could spiral into a series of payments that sunk an entire family into debt. In many cases, refusing or being unable to pay the fine triggered additional punishments, creating a cycle in which the woman's rebellion became a long-term source of income for the local lord or the crown. These fines were not random. They were calculated to fracture economic stability and reinforce dependency. Beyond monetary penalties, kingdoms found ways to extract labor from accused women. Forced labor, framed as corrective service, provided free manpower for tasks ranging from agricultural work to maintenance of public structures. This labor was frequently disguised as moral correction or community service, masking its exploitative nature behind language that framed obedience as duty. While men in similar positions were often assigned tasks requiring physical strength, women were assigned work designed to be repetitive, exhausting, and socially degrading. Their bodies became engines of profit for the authorities that claimed to be restoring order. Even property seized during accusations contributed to the wealth of the ruling classes. Land, tools, livestock, and stored goods could be confiscated under the justification that they were needed to compensate the community or the local lord for the disruption caused by the woman's behavior. What was framed as restitution was often little more than legalized theft. In many villages, these seizures reshaped the distribution of wealth, transferring resources from the poor to those already in power. The woman at the center of the accusation rarely regained any of what was taken, even if she completed her punishment or proved her innocence. There was also a subtler form of economic violence, the disruption of a woman's ability to work. Punishments that publicly marked her, isolated her socially, or restricted her movements directly undermined her capacity to contribute to her household or to generate income. In societies where survival hinged on constant labor, this loss had devastating consequences. A woman who could no longer sell goods at the market, participate in harvests, or trade with neighboring villages quickly became a financial burden on her family. This pressure, in turn, reinforced the belief that rebellion brought ruin, further discouraging resistance among others who witnessed the fallout. Over time, the economic exploitation of rebellious women became embedded in the political structure of medieval life. What began as punishment expanded into a system that sustained itself through the steady extraction of wealth and labor from those least able to resist. Kingdoms masked these practices behind moral language and legal procedures, but at their core, they represented a calculated strategy. The suffering of peasant women did not merely uphold the social order, it fed the economic engine that kept that order in place. As we uncover this dimension of oppression, the picture grows clearer. Control in the medieval world was not just enforced through fear, but through a deliberate intertwining of violence and profit, ensuring that rebellion from the poorest women could be converted into yet another resource for those at the top. As kingdoms refined their methods of social, religious, and economic control, they also began to reinterpret female defiance as something far more dangerous than simple disobedience. Peasant women who resisted orders were gradually transformed, in the language of authorities, into political threats. Their acts were recast not as personal conflicts, but as challenges to the stability of the realm. This shift allowed rulers to justify increasingly severe measures, presenting their punishments as necessary to defend the kingdom from internal collapse. What made this transformation so insidious was the way it elevated ordinary women into symbolic enemies, turning their bodies and voices into battlegrounds for broader political anxieties. The medieval state operated with fragile authority. Its power depended on the perception that the social hierarchy was natural, unquestionable, and divinely sanctioned. When a woman from the lowest ranks refused a tax, protected her land, or confronted a corrupt official, her defiance pierced the illusion of harmony. Even if her resistance affected only her immediate surroundings, rulers feared that such acts could spread, encouraging others to question the legitimacy of those in power. By labeling her as a political disruptor, the authorities could justify responses far more severe than the original offense. This reclassification of rebellion expanded the arsenal of our punishments available to the state. Women were increasingly accused of inciting disorder, endangering communal peace, or weakening the authority of local lords. These accusations carried heavy symbolic weight. They suggested that the woman's actions were not merely personal grievances, but part of a broader, potentially contagious threat. In many villages, the mere rumor that a woman was undermining authority was enough to trigger intervention from officials who felt compelled to act swiftly, not because of immediate danger, but because of the fear of what defiance represented. As political language seeped into local disputes, the punishments themselves shifted in tone. They became less about correcting behavior and more about reaffirming the supremacy of the ruling class. A woman who refused to yield could be subjected to public oaths of loyalty, forced declarations of submission, or interrogations designed to extract confessions of intent she never possessed. These procedures were crafted to demonstrate the state's ability to break resistance, no matter how small. The message was unmistakable. Questioning authority, even privately, even momentarily, was an act with political consequences. Villages were encouraged to view rebellious women as individuals whose personal instability threatened the entire community. By reshaping defiance into political deviance, the authorities ensured that women who resisted were not seen as victims of injustice, but as agents of disorder. This narrative isolated them even further. Neighbors who might have shared their frustrations were now pressured to distance themselves, fearing association with someone labeled a political danger. In this way, the state turned public opinion into its most effective weapon, ensuring that defiance found no refuge. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this transformation was its ability to erase the woman's original motive. Once cast as a political threat, her personal experience vanished beneath layers of imposed meaning. A conflict over resources became evidence of disloyalty. A refusal to obey became a sign of destabilizing influence. Her identity was rewritten by the state, her voice drowned out by the narrative imposed upon her. Through this process, medieval kingdoms turned ordinary women into symbols of disorder, using their suffering to reinforce the illusion of an unshakable hierarchy. As the machinery of control expanded, the political framing of female rebellion became a cornerstone of medieval governance, ensuring that even small acts of resistance could be transformed into justification for escalating forms of domination that reach deeper into the lives of those least protected. As the political framing of female defiance grew stronger, medieval kingdoms developed methods of silencing that went far beyond public humiliation or economic ruin. These were practices designed not just to punish, but to erase, to ensure that rebellious peasant women disappeared from communal memory as effectively as they were removed from daily life. Some kingdoms relied on official procedures, others on unwritten customs enforced by local authorities, but the purpose was always the same: extinguish a woman's influence by severing her from visibility, voice, and identity. These tactics operated in the shadows, leaving few written traces, yet their impact shaped entire generations who learned, through fear, what happened to those who refused obedience. One of the most Common forms of disappearance was the manipulation of space. Officials would force women into isolation, confining them to remote outbuildings, abandoned structures, or monastic areas where supervision was strict and opportunities for communication were nearly non-existent. This was not dramatic imprisonment. It was slow erasure. Days turned into weeks as the woman's absence blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the village. The community grew accustomed to life without her, and in time, her name became an uncomfortable memory few dared to mention. Another method involved forced relocation. A woman deemed too disruptive could be sent to a distant settlement under the pretext of restoring peace. But these transfers were not acts of mercy. They were calculated to sever her social network and remove any chance of her returning to her former life. Once displaced, she had no protection, no allies, and no witnesses to her past. In many cases, the journey itself became another form of punishment, exposing her to harsh travel conditions and the whims of those tasked with escorting her. By the time she reached the new location, she was stripped of the connections that anchored her identity. There were also practices that targeted the woman's ability to communicate. Authorities sometimes imposed silent penances, forbidding her from speaking publicly, or restricting her interactions to a small circle of approved individuals. This tactic subtly undermined her credibility. A woman who could not speak, could not defend herself, share her experiences, or warn others about the abuse she had endured. Her silence became the weapon that buried her story deeper than any physical confinement could. Communal rituals played an equally destructive role. Some villages staged symbolic expulsions in which the woman's presence was formally rejected by the community. These rituals rarely appear in records because they relied on oral transmission, but their effects were profound. Once, expelled symbolically, even if she remained physically nearby, she became socially invisible. Neighbors avoided her, trade became impossible, and shared spaces closed around her like a tightening net. Survival in such conditions was nearly unattainable, ensuring that the woman either fled or succumbed to the isolation imposed upon her. Perhaps the darkest tactic was the strategic use of ambiguity. Instead of documenting punishments clearly, officials allowed details to dissolve into rumor. Woman might fall ill, be taken for questioning, or sent away for correction, phrases that concealed the reality of forced disappearance. The lack of clarity served a dual purpose. It protected those responsible and instilled fear in those who remained. If no one knew exactly what happened, everyone imagined the worst. And this imagination became a powerful barrier against dissent. These methods of silencing were not accidents of history. They were tools crafted to ensure that rebellion left no trace beyond a lingering sense of unease. They transformed real women into shadows, into warnings carried quietly through generations. Before we continue, I would like to hear your perspective. Which of these hidden methods of disappearance struck you the most, or made you reflect on how many voices were erased without a single written word? Share your thoughts in the comments so we can expand the conversation as the next layers of this story unfold. As the medieval machinery of control expanded, violence against rebellious peasant women evolved into something even more calculated. A form of public theater, crafted to reinforce power through spectacle. Punishment was not merely a response to wrongdoing. It became a performance staged to shape collective memory. Villages gathered not out of curiosity alone, but because these events were structured to instruct, to intimidate, and to anchor loyalty to the ruling class. When a woman defied expectations, the repercussions were choreographed so that everyone present internalized a single message. Resistance was a danger with consequences too visible to forget. Public squares, markets, and crossroads became arenas where this spectacle unfolded. Authorities understood the psychological impact of transforming punishment into a communal ritual. Instead of hiding violence, they amplified it, ensuring that its imagery settled deep into the consciousness of those who watched. A rebellious woman brought before the crowd was stripped not just of dignity, but of narrative. She no longer appeared as a person with grievances or struggles. She became a symbol crafted by those in power. Each gesture, each forced confession, each imposed humiliation contributed to the script. The audience itself played an unspoken role. People were expected to react in ways that supported the performance. Silence, murmurs of disapproval, or even forced participation became part of the choreography. When a woman was displayed as an example, the villagers' reactions, whether coerced or voluntary, helped validate the punishment. This psychological pressure made the community complicit, blurring the line between observers and enforcers. Even those who felt sympathy understood the danger of expressing it openly, knowing that dissent could easily shift attention onto them. Fear spread from the punished woman to every onlooker, embedding obedience deep within the collective mind. Certain punishments were designed for maximum symbolic impact. Devices with exaggerated shapes, humiliating garments, and props meant to ridicule or distort the woman's appearance turned violence into a visual language. These symbols communicated authority without requiring words. A woman forced to stand in stocks near the church entrance was positioned where faith, power, and community intersected. Her immobilized body served as a reminder that even the most familiar spaces could transform into instruments of domination. Market days, festivals, and religious processions were deliberately chosen times for these displays, ensuring the largest possible audience. Spectacle also functioned as a means of rewriting events. Once a punishment was performed publicly, the official narrative overshadowed the woman's original act. Her resistance, however justified, became irrelevant. The performance recast her as morally flawed, socially disruptive, or spiritually dangerous. In time, people remembered the spectacle far more vividly than the circumstances that led to it. The state's interpretation replaced truth, embedding itself into oral tradition and cultural memory. This manipulation was one of the most effective tools of medieval authority, for it shaped how future generations understood rebellion. Additionally, the aftermath of these public punishments extended the spectacle beyond the event itself. Women marked by the experience carried its symbolism wherever they went. Scars, damaged clothing, altered behavior, each detail served as a mobile version of the performance, a reminder that the state's reach extended into every moment of life. Even if the physical punishment ended, the social consequences continued indefinitely, reinforcing the spectacle long after the crowd dispersed. Through these orchestrated displays, medieval kingdoms cultivated a world where violence became a familiar language. People learned to read its signals, internalize its lessons, and adjust their actions accordingly. And for peasant women, this transformation of violence into spectacle meant that their suffering was never private, never forgotten, and never allowed to fade quietly into the margins of daily life. As public spectacles carved fear into the collective imagination, medieval kingdoms turned to another powerful tool to secure obedience: the construction of myths that distorted the identities of rebellious women long after the punishment ended. These narratives were not accidental. They were carefully shaped to ensure that the memory of resistance was overwritten by stories that justified the violence inflicted upon them. In the absence of literacy among most villagers, spoken narratives held immense authority. Myths spread faster than facts, and those who controlled the storytelling controlled the legacy of those they punished. At the heart of this manipulation was the deliberate reshaping of motives. A woman who resisted exploitation might later be remembered as someone guided by irrational impulses or moral shortcomings. Her refusal to accept unfair treatment became exaggerated into tales of instability, deceit, or danger. These distortions served two purposes. First, they protected the reputation of those in power by reframing resistance as the isolated actions of an aberrant individual, rather than the predictable outcome of systemic injustice. Second, They neutralized any sympathy that might have grown in her absence. By assigning her traits that provoked fear or disdain, the authorities ensured that even private admiration became socially risky. These myths often drew upon pre-existing cultural fears. Allegations of uncontrolled emotion, unpredictable behavior, or supernatural influence were woven into stories that circulated for years. The imagery associated with these women evolved into something larger than life, detached from reality, and yet accepted without question. Villagers repeated these tales during gatherings, markets, and religious festivals, rarely aware of how, effectively, they reinforced the mechanisms of control. Even children grew up hearing them, absorbing the warning embedded between the lines. Stepping outside the expected role could transform anyone into a cautionary legend. Over time, entire communities participated in maintaining these distorted narratives. Collective memory became a collaborative construction in which the truth mattered far less than the function the story served. If a woman had been humiliated, disappeared, or relocated, the myth explained her absence in a way that preserved the established hierarchy. Villagers who might have once defended her grew to accept the official version of events simply because it provided stability. The more frequently a story was repeated, the more indisputable it seemed, even if no one could point to a single concrete detail that originated with the woman herself. Clerics, too, played a significant role in reinforcing these legends. Sermons often referenced women of questionable virtue or spiritual danger, blending local rumors with broader moral narratives. Without naming the punished women directly, these stories allowed the community to connect the dots, transforming the individual into an archetype. By spiritualizing her supposed flaws, the church helped to seal her fate in the collective imagination. Her rebellion no longer appeared as a reaction to oppression, but as the manifestation of deeper moral failings that justified divine correction. Storytellers, travelers, and market vendors added their own embellishments over time, ensuring that the myths evolved as they moved from village to village. A woman who had challenged a corrupt tax collector might eventually be described as someone unable to control her impulses, or as a figure who brought misfortune to those around her. These shifts obscured the original context of her resistance, burying it beneath layers of invention. Once the story achieved its final form, it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the society that used it to discipline itself. Through this process, medieval kingdoms weaponized memory itself. They understood that punishing a woman controlled the present, but shaping her story controlled the future. Myth replaced reality, transforming victims into villains and rebellion into disorderly chaos. These fabricated identities remained in circulation long after the woman vanished, becoming part of the folklore that taught each new generation where the boundaries lay and what fate awaited those who dared to cross them. The legacy of violence against rebellious peasant women did not end with their immediate punishment or with the myths that obscured their stories. It persisted across generations, leaving deep marks on the collective consciousness and shaping how kingdoms, villages, and families understood power, obedience, and resistance. By the time the 16th century arrived, the lessons embedded in fear, social exclusion, and spectacle had become codified into the daily rhythms of life. A woman who challenged authority, even subtly, risked her livelihood, her community standing, and her very identity. Her story, erased in official records, lived on through whispers, cautionary tales, and the silent memory of those who had witnessed the cruelty. This enduring influence shaped more than individual lives. It created a culture where defiance was perceived not as a moral choice or a claim to justice, but as an existential threat to the social order. Entire communities learned to monitor themselves, enforcing obedience without the constant presence of soldiers or officials. Fear, humiliation, and economic control became instruments of governance as effective as any sword. And yet, even in this oppressive machinery, the traces of resilience persisted. Women found ways to survive, to continue their labor, their prayers, and their influence in subtle, almost invisible forms. Their endurance challenged the totality of the system, revealing cracks in the facade of absolute control. In hindsight, we can see that these methods were not just punitive, they were strategic. By erasing women's voices and rewriting their narratives, kingdoms sought to control the past, present, and future simultaneously. The moral and economic lessons imposed through punishment, spectacle, and myth ensured that the consequences of rebellion were embedded in the psyche of every observer. Communities became complicit in their own governance, internalizing the lessons of fear and obedience. And yet, despite centuries of suppression, the memory of resistance survived in fragments, waiting for those who would reconstruct the hidden truths. The importance of understanding this history cannot be overstated. These women's experiences illuminate not only the cruelty of medieval systems, but also the ways in which power manipulates memory, perception, and narrative to maintain itself. Recognizing their suffering and their resilience allows us to see patterns that extend far beyond the medieval period, echoing in structures of control and oppression that persist even today. Every detail recovered, every story pieced together, challenges the sanitized versions of history and brings us closer to the truths deliberately buried by those in power. If you followed this story to the very end, take a moment to reflect on what it means to witness history through the eyes of those who were forced to endure it. If this exploration of forgotten resistance resonates with you, leave a comment saying something like, "I'm with this story until the end," or "This message was for me." Hit the like button if you value uncovering hidden truths, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel to continue exploring these dark, powerful chapters of human history. There's a video waiting for you right next to this one that dives even deeper into how ordinary individuals shaped and survived the machinery of oppression. So click over and continue with me as we uncover the next layer of history's hidden truths.